Hello, my name is Victoria Elliott. I'm the marketing manager from Utari. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, From Noise to Clarity, Strategies for Dealing with Unwanted Voice Calls in Contact Centers. Now, let's do some introductions. Today's session is led by Chuck French, our Chief Growth Officer from Utari. Good afternoon, Chuck.
Hi, Vicki.
And also by Vicki Sador, our Vice President of Channel Development and Sales from Utari. Good afternoon, Vicki.
Hey, Vicki.
And last, we have Skylar Jackson, our Solutions Architect and Sales Engineer. Good afternoon, Skylar.
Hey, Vicki.
Today's session will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent to you after today's webinar concludes. You'll also find a handout that you can download from the handout section of the menu. Simply click on the PDF to download. We'll also pause several times throughout the webinar to answer any questions you may have. Please type your questions in the GoToWebinar box and maybe in the bottom right-hand corner of your window. And with that, we will begin with Chuck.
Thanks again, Vicki. We've been looking forward to this webinar for a long time. And today, we're going to discuss unwanted voice calls in the contact center environment, the implication of those calls, and strategies to address the problem. So here we go. This agenda will show you how we're going to tackle the subject. I have to tell you, this is really important. Our intent is to be thorough, yet keep a brisk pace. So as we move through the agenda, we'll take breaks, as we just heard from Vicki. So please, ask questions. We absolutely love them. Okay. So there you have your presenters for today. Sorry, Skylar, we don't have you in there today. But I'm Chuck French, Chief Growth Officer from Utari, and that's my colleague, Vicki Sador. As you just heard, Vicki is VP of Sales and Channel. And I'm joining from Utari's headquarters just outside of Chicago in a town called Rolling Meadows. And Vicki's joining from beautiful Lexington, Kentucky. So there you have it. Okay. A few comments about Utari, which, as you can see on the screen, is a Latin word that means to change. We've been building enterprise software for over 30 years. We have hundreds of enterprise clients. They're located in every vertical. Reputationally, we're known for building great technology coupled with unparalleled support. And everybody in our company is proud. We guard that reputation. We're also known for innovation. So despite being around for 30 years, we still act like a perpetual startup. They got little client, employee, or even partner turnover. Plus, and this is really important, all Utari employees are owners of the company by our employee stock ownership plan. So I like to tell people we're the most aligned company that I've ever been associated, and the ESOP has a big role in that. But sometimes people also ask, what are you guys all aligned around? It's not just the company. Well, we're all aligned around being the undisputed leader in a new and emerging product category that we've defined as voice threat defense. Our solution, which is a voice firewall, is called the voice traffic filter. I'm going to add one more point too. There's an origin story here. Utari has the world's leading business voicemail solution, which we call Utari Voice. It's incredible. Customers love it. It's the best. And our work on Utari Voice gave Utari the authority to build the Utari Voice Traffic Filter. And it was given to us by our customers. And they said, listen, we know you, we trust you, and we need to solve this important problem of stopping unwanted calls. And that's the subject we're talking about today. So in summary, we're a pretty proud company. All right, so let's get into the problem. Our objective here is clearly educational, right? Despite the hype around self-service portals, email, chat, social media, all are important in an omni-channel contact center. The voice channel remains the preferred channel for customers in contact centers. There's a couple reasons why. It's more effective for complex issues. Right, by the way, that's true for all of us, right, as we're communicating amongst each other. It's more reliable, and it's definitely more personal, but it's not protected. When we look at the data, in general, about 1 in 10 calls coming into the contact center are unwanted. And for many organizations, the impact of these unwanted calls have never been quantified. Well, we're here to tell you that unwanted calls are not harmless. They impact your KPIs, customer experience, and the security of your organization, and that of the customers you serve. And these calls come in plenty of flavors. And this is a very brief look at the various tactics. We all know what robocalls are. I say this often, but it really is one of the few things humans generally agree upon. We don't like them, and we certainly don't want them in our organization. Spoof calls are calls displaying a caller ID that's manipulated. I think we all know what those are now. Voice spam is a generic term for any sort of unsolicited telephone call, whether it be a human or otherwise. Phishing is voice phishing. That's the equivalent of an email phishing attack where individuals are targeted. And then voice spam storms are a bunch of robocalls coming at the same time with the intent to defraud or disrupt normal communications. And in the call center environment, they can also be associated with toll fraud, which again is another form of stealing. And today, obviously, most people are now familiar with socially engineered attacks. Those attempts to deceive us and manipulate us as human beings, get us to divulge information that could be used for bad purposes. Well, with the amount of information that's online on the dark web, and heck, with the help of AI, it's getting easier and easier to execute plausible attacks that we as humans, we react to. So why are these tactics even used? Any of them? Well, bad actors like the voice channel, because it's unprotected. And for most organizations, someone can dial up and come right in the front door. So here are some stats to support the pervasiveness and the seriousness of the problem of unwanted calls. Just last month, there were over 5 billion robocalls placed in the US, which was a 13% increase over the prior months. 45% of robocalls are scam calls. Year over year, phishing attacks, they're up 550%. And those phishing attacks have a 37% success rate. 7 of 10 companies have been impacted by phishing attacks. And potentially most relevant for this discussion, fraud is up 40% in contact centers. All this is amazing, and none of this is discussed enough. It's just not. The IT and cybersecurity analyst communities, they're definitely laggards when it comes to reporting this information and advising their clients. They don't see it as a top priority. They believe implementing effective solutions is difficult, and they have a general lack of awareness of the risks. So with all this in mind, we're glad you're here because this is an important topic. All right, so let's drill down. What is the impact of unwanted calls to the contact center? So Mitari, we've been helping customers filter unwanted calls for many years. And although one customer may define an unwanted call very different than another one, once it's deemed unwanted, there isn't one positive aspect of the call, zero. They want to see it gone. And in the contact center specifically, where so many decisions are made on metrics, we know that when unwanted calls get in, they're harming the contact center's ability to make business decisions based on sound data. They skew the KPIs and metrics. When these unwanted calls get into the contact center, they're taking away a resource from someone who could be helping a customer, diminishing the customer experience in some way. And then lastly, when these unwanted calls get into the contact center, they allow a cyber criminal to extract information from a customer contact agent to begin the attack chain for a data breach. Or in the case of Robinhood or Twitter, two widely covered instances where customer support personnel were socially engineered, those unwanted calls provided a pathway for bad actors to steal information. And it was sizable. In Robinhood's case, email addresses for about 5 million Robinhood users were exposed. And the full names of a different group, about 2 million users. They eventually settled a class action suit regarding this data breach for $20 million. This is not rocket science. This is common sense. There are implications to these unwanted calls. And we're going to prove that last point. Together, we're going to drill down into some de-identified data from a Mitari customer that was prepared by an independent third-party consultant. So what you're looking at are calls coming into the contact center in 30-minute increments, starting at 8:30 a.m. and ending at 5 p.m. And over the course of the day, about 50,000 calls were received. And you'll see these calls are marked good and bad. And that yellow column represents the percentage of bad calls identified in each 30-minute increment. So here are the takeaways. 68% of voice calls in this contact center were received between 8:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. But 85% of unwanted calls were received during these same hours. Bad actors are attacking this contact center during normal business hours. That may or may not be surprising, but The bad actors today are businesses. So in that regard, it makes sense. They're trying to optimize their businesses too. So when we look at the yellow column, that range of unwanted calls during normal business hours between 4 and 7%, the average was about 5.5%. So let's figure out the cost of these calls from a productivity perspective. Using some conservative industry standards, meaning your costs are probably higher, we ran the math to determine the financial impact of all these unwanted calls. First, we assumed the fully loaded cost of a 10-minute voice call to the contact center was $2.50. Again, conservative. Second, we assume the time to handle an unwanted call is significantly lower. Well, why would that be? Well, the agent wouldn't spend 10 minutes on a robocall or a dead air call, but there would be some time they would have to spend. So we assume the agent would spend 20% of their time on that same call. So we'll call that 2 minutes, a standard amongst our customers. So those calls cost the contact center 50 cents. When you extrapolate the loss of these resources across 18 million calls over the course of the year, this contact center was losing over $500,000 a year just to these unwanted calls, the equivalent of 10 and likely more agents. Again, very conservative look at the impact, but it's a real example, and these are real dollars. But the productivity impact of these unwanted calls is just the tip of the iceberg. These unwanted calls are reducing agent productivity, skewing KPIs, and negatively impacting the customer experience. And you won't see it on this list, but these calls are also increasing the security risk in the contact center environment. None of this is conceptual. It's real, it's pervasive, and if you aren't asking your contact center software provider about their strategy to address these calls, you're missing an important differentiation point. Stopping these calls are becoming a standard RFP question when evaluating different platforms. They're that dangerous. So at this point, I hope that at a minimum, there's a sense of respect for the problem. But there's hope to solve, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, I've been going on for a little bit here. Vicki, do we have any questions?
Hey, Chuck, no, not at this time. It's still just taking it all in, I think. And so don't forget, if you have a little pop-up box, there might be a little orange button as well. You can click on that to pop it out to type in your questions.
We promise to be brisk, so this is good. We're going to keep rolling. All right, so here we go. We've got an understanding of the implications of the calls. So how would you go about protecting the voice channel? So when it comes to taking action to stop unwanted calls into your environment, there's some obvious things you need to consider when you're looking at different solutions, right? Is the solution effective? Does it integrate? Is it scalable, flexible, cost-effective, easy to use? I could go on and on. Those are the standard questions. We'd also suggest you take a step back and also consider the following. First, accept you're trying to solve for something that's constantly changing. It's complex. You'll want to learn more about the tactics the bad actors are using, and then, based on your specific needs, determine how to thwart the attacks. Next, depending on the type of voice traffic your organization is fielding and the risk associated with the calls, you might need to bring in different resources within your organization into the discussion. You might have to bring in risk departments, some other areas, all right, to field that out. And last, we firmly believe there's no single solution to defend the voice channel. There are some vendors that specialize in protecting outbound calls, some specialize on inbound, and in some cases, an ecosystem approach is required. Or perhaps more appropriately, a layered approach might be needed, where each layer has different capabilities with the express goal of protecting your agents and your customers' data. All right, so here's an example of what an ecosystem approach would look like when addressing inbound calls in the contact center. So we'll start with a voice traffic firewall or a filter. So this technology, they'll look at the inbound caller data, the metadata associated with the calls. It'll look at call patterns, and it's going to determine whether or not the incoming call is potentially a nuisance or a nefarious call. And the objective of that layer is to triage the call or do something with it before it even reaches the contact center, all right, into the agent. The next layer is call authentication. And I think obviously most people on this call understand what it does, but it's a little bit, it'll have some of the technology of the firewall, but it serves a different purpose, right? You're using voice detection, knowledge-based questions for authentication, device profiling, physical tokens, maybe many other things that you're going to use to verify the identity of the caller. But once authenticated, the call can be expedited and properly routed to the appropriate resources. Then last, there's specific technologies for fraud detection. And just like voice traffic filtering and call authentication, fraud detection may use some of those adjacent technologies, but usually fraud detection is used when the call is connected to the agent and the system detects some signs of weird behavior or attributes and so forth. And that's the last line of defense. So in a contact center environment, all these layers can be embedded into the logic of the call flows. And in any of these applications, a call can be routed to a higher level or specialized resource specifically trained to address the suspect call. But let's look at it in a typical linear contact center call flow to illustrate how these applications work in that ecosystem approach to voice defense. So moving left to right, the first step is obviously a call coming in. Here we denote it as incoming call. There you go. Next, the voice traffic filter or filter or firewall. They'll look at the call right before it gets any further into the contact center environment and prior to any other action, and before the call gets to CRM or the IVR. All right, so we'll get in the specifics of the solution later, but this is where Mutari's role. This is our role. This is where we fit. We're the voice firewall. So after passing the voice traffic firewall and continuing the CRM lookup and IVR, then the call is authenticated. Now, note how the call authentication occurs just prior to a call being placed in the agent queue. And then next, the agent now engages the caller. And at this point, fraud detection occurs. As we discussed on the prior page, all these applications, whether it's a firewall for, or a call authentication or fraud detection, they all have important roles and they can support each other. But at a minimum, we're avid believers that a voice traffic firewall should be in place. The firewall forms a broad line, front line of protection for the voice call. It detects and removes the majority of unwanted inbound calls, the majority of known robocallers, voice spam, spoof calls, phishing, those voice spam storms, and the social engineering calls. If a layer is eliminated, if a call that's coming in at this layer is eliminated, there's also a significant reduction in the utilization of all the other systems and resources. And also, I'll point this out now, as many of you have probably already recognized, this call flow looks very much like a screen from a call flow builder found in many modern CCAS systems. And for most leading systems, Mutari is a prefabricated module that can be added to the call flow. It can be installed and traffic can be sent, let's say, to a test group in about an hour. Okay. So at this point in our webinar, you know what the Mutari voice filter does and why it does it, right? But we showed you that by what it does by focusing on the problem it solves. Now we're going to tell you a little bit about the how, right? How it solves the problem of unwanted calls. And we're first going to examine the firewall depicted on the right side, which you can also see behind me today. So each of these layers of the wall represent a different protection layer of Mutari's voice traffic filter. And in every instance, the system's goal is to either allow or route or drop a call based on your organization's specific requirements, not ours. You control what calls enter your environment and ultimately what gets to an agent. We welcome the chance to do a deep dive on the system and show you a demo and so forth, but for now, I'm just going to briefly touch upon each one of these layers. So first off, everyone on this call, I'm sure, is familiar with stir shaking, right? Those technologies determine whether a call ID is validated. Mutari is not a stir shaking replacement. The voice traffic filter gives our customers, right, or you, to decide how to block a call based on stir shaking data in the call. And again, that's a common theme you're going to keep hearing. You decide what comes into your environment. The choice is yours. The next layer is the Mutari's proprietary dynamic database, which is a huge database of phone numbers that are spoofed or known to have poor calling reputations. The database taps into multiple worldwide resources that are dedicated to tracking, verifying, and reporting literally tens of millions of these nuisance calls do not originate or nefarious phone numbers behind most of the spam, scam, phishing, and robocall campaigns. And depending on the rule settings, the system either drops the call, lets it through to the intended recipient, or sends it somewhere else. Let's say a special skills group, like we talked about earlier in your contact center. There it can be further scrutinized. Threat radar, simply put, this layer analyzes the call with respect to your organization's specific call patterns, your call volumes, etc. And there's machine learning involved there, and we understand the typical call pattern, and then when appropriate, we act when the abnormal calls are presented. Then custom rules is exactly what you think it is. It's a powerful organizational specific data block list that also allows you to build lists they had a higher level of control over what's flowing into the contact center. It directs the filter to handle calls from numbers, number types, called party IDs, CNAM, you define it in your organization. And lastly, voice capture. That's our fail-safe application. So if a system suspects a call is fraudulent because the number was found in the dynamic database, or perhaps the call is invalidated by the carrier in the stir-shaken signaling, or maybe the threat radar picks up some strange calling patterns, you might want to consider sending it to the capture rather than just dropping the call. So the voice capture asks the caller to enter a couple of random digits to continue. It's extremely successful at detecting robocalls. And before I forget to mention it, all of these layers, they all work together. And I'm not showing it right now, but all these rules are accessible and configurable via a really modern and easy to use administrative portal. And I'll stress that last point again, it's really easy to use, and it's clearly a differentiation point for us. So I'm gonna recap this. There's a lot on the screen, but we reviewed the problem of unwanted calls. Mitari Solutions quickly implemented in just about an hour, delivers immediate impact, contains 5 layers of protection, while seamlessly working with the other voice threat defense solutions like call authentication and fraud detection, stops unwanted calls prior to the IVR and getting to the agent, and it's designed from inception to do no harm by allowing wanted calls to ring through. By doing all of this, the contact center's KPIs and metrics become more accurate, the customer experience improves, and the contact center becomes more secure. So we're going to pause here for a moment before we transition to Vicki, who's going to pull it all together and bring us home. Vicki Elliott, do we have questions now?
Hi, Chuck. Great. Thank you. Yes, we do actually have a couple questions that came in.
Okay.
The first one is asking about hang-up calls. They get a lot of calls that just hang up on them. Is this something that we can handle?
Hang-up calls.
So I think a lot of calls that are coming in and after 2 or 3 seconds, they're just hanging up.
We see a lot of dead air calls in the contact center environment, and the answer is yes. That's kind of one of the primary things that actually we hear from contact centers on the regular. So the short answer is yes. We'd need to dig a little deeper to see if people are just hanging up on you, but most likely you're speaking to dead air calls.
Great, thank you. We do have one more question. We are migrating from a premise-based contact center to Genesys. Can you support us in the Genesys cloud? Chuck, is this something you can speak to?
Absolutely, and Vicki Stewart, we'll talk to this in a little bit. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but we are fully integrated with Genesys and their cloud offering, and are actually part of their App Foundry as a premium offering. So that would answer that question, but we'll talk to that a little bit more in a bit.
Great. Yeah, we do have another question. I think, again, we're jumping still ahead here. Is Mitari a cloud solution or on-prem solution?
My work here is done.
We're taking away all of Vicki's piece here. So yes.
Good question.
Yeah.
The answer is yes, and I'll actually tell you more in a second.
But thank you for the questions. Keep asking them. We like the questions.
Yes. These are great. These are great.
Yeah, so I think we'll keep rolling and we can answer as we go.
Okay, interrupt me, no big deal. We just had a really good story from Chuck that I think is worth us kind of taking to the next level. So Chuck spoke about one of our clients, and what he did was really define the finances around their problem prior to us solving it, right? So he talked about the time frames and the number of calls coming within a specified time frame. And that client actually gave us the details to drill it all the way down to the amount of time that it cost them and what that meant in dollars. So now I get to take the backside of that, right? What happened after we installed? What was their result? And you see that on the screen. A lot of really good things happen. So you notice that Chuck spoke to that kind of 5.5% average unwanted call rate. Well, interestingly enough, we're now we're filtering out about 11% of of their overall call volume that they've defined as being considered unwanted. That's a significant number. So remember, we're solving a $500,000 problem and realizing that potentially that problem could have even been larger than they thought. The result of that is about 1.3 million annual unwanted calls for them. That's significant. And if we know our industry averages, we're looking at almost half of those calls being a potential security threat. So as you can see, the impact of solving it is real. Now, for this particular client, they gave us some really good insight into kind of what was their overall benefit. So for them, their big concern was getting their agents focusing on the revenue driving calls. So for them, interestingly enough, to the previous question that came up, they were actually going through, they were an on-prem Genesis client going through a migration into their CCaaS system, and they were really excited about that transition. But they realized, wait a minute, we can't migrate until we get this filtering into place. So they stopped because it was so important. So for one of the things that they were doing, which I found really interesting, is we can take that inbound call traffic and using their CCaaS system and the APIs we have built, they could reroute those calls. So back to the topic here, the agent focus on revenue driving calls. The proper agents could take the calls that we identified as being appropriate, while we could filter those other calls in through their other workflows into agents that they wanted to have actually triage potentially unwanted calls, a really important factor for them. So of course that helped them to get time to resolution, focusing on the correct calls, and of course SLAs were achieved. And as Chuck said, right, customer experience is the ultimate result of any KPI. It's not just the dollars, but the experience. So for them, getting to those customers more quickly, getting them out of the hold queue was a legitimate concern and something that they were really proud of solving. In terms of the why and what they decided to use ultimately for us was they wanted to actually be able to integrate really well with Genesis. They wanted to be on-prem or in the cloud, or if they had a transition point, they wanted to be hybrid. That flexibility was super important. And of course, measuring the ROI results that we've just talked about. How do we go to market? So this is really important because I've actually heard a lot of questions about, as folks are migrating to new platforms and new strategies, they want to make sure that we're right there with them. So as we kind of wrap up, I want you to understand kind of where we're playing and what we're doing and why. So if you remember Chuck talking about when we started, we've been doing this for years. Obviously, we have the authority based on our voicemail experience. So we started out in the enterprise space. But as we've learned more and more over the years, we've noticed that obviously the contact center is the big gaping hole for where these calls enter the most. So what we did is we put a strategic focus on who are the best players in the market. So we tackled it based on the Gartner quadrant, as you see here. In green, you see we have strategic partnerships. We were chosen by them by choice to work with folks like Cisco, Five9, NICE, and Genesis. Those API applications are already in market. You can purchase them today, and it takes about an hour to set up. We're also in development with some other important players, folks like TalkDesk or Content Guru or AWS. A lot of you guys are using these systems. So just because it says in development doesn't mean it won't be very long before, or it would be very long before we're in play. So all of these are API driven. So Chuck said earlier, in about an hour, we can get these up and running. If you're not on a CCaaS system though, don't fret. We still work with our on-prem players using our SIP integration, and we'd love to talk more about it. So the idea here, we can be on-prem, and you can go ahead and advance it, Chuck. We can be on-prem, we can be in your cloud environment, and of course, we can be a combination of both. This is in play now in UC, UCaaS, CCaaS, you get the idea with the most important players that you guys are already working with. The idea for us is we're trying to make it as simple as we can for you guys to solve this problem quickly. So as we start really getting this wrapped up, one of the things I hear a lot, and actually before we start, do we have any questions, Victoria?
Hi, Vicki. Yep, we actually do have one question, and I'll direct this for you if that's okay. We have a couple questions that came up about call blocking. So if a call came in through all of the layers, but let's say it was still deemed as a problem or even as an inappropriate call, can an admin then add them to the Mitari solution to block or possibly reroute them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's just say we identify a call as an unwanted call. We have a really robust call history, or we can do this on the fly with our personal block list. But any call can be deemed immediately into the custom rules section that Chuck spoke about as something that they just simply don't want to have in the first place. So it can automatically be blocked. Now, remember, as those calls are coming into that filter, like Chuck said, we make decisions based on customers' rules. We can pass the call through. We can drop that call automatically, or we can reroute or divert that call based on their needs. But we can automatically set up rules for kind of ongoing on any number they identify.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll hold the rest of the questions for right now.
Okay, all right. So as we've worked with our clients, we hear a lot of conversation about them trying to kind of really understand their environment, right? Most of you guys on this, if you're working in a contact center, you know you're getting some of these calls. You may not know what that actually looks like for your environment. So I'm going to give you kind of your next steps as we wrap this up. And you've got some QR codes. Grab your camera and hold it up if you'd like, and it'll take you right where you need to go. But the 3 next steps you can take are, number 1, let's set up a live demo. This particular webinar was purposefully meant to educate you on what's really happening and what that impact means to the business. So let's focus on the solution. We can set up a demo, let you play with it, and really kind of knock it down into your kind of scenario and circumstances to see what works or doesn't work in your world. The next action item for you guys is a 30-day trial. So for our CCAS, very easily in our CCAS worlds, we can install this thing, get it up and running in about an hour. You can test it out with a test workflow. We can run it in passive analyze where we're not actually taking any action until you feel confident. And then we can turn it on for 30 days. We can measure your KPIs prior and measure them after. So you have hard data to show what is and isn't working for your system. Really important. And then the last action item you can take is an assessment. So let's just say you are on-prem and you want to get a really quick insight into what's happening in your environment. Let's gain some visibility. We can take your CDR records, 30 days minimum, up to 90 days, or even a year we can do. And we'll run that against one layer of our filter, and we'll provide you guys back with a board level report showing you what we found in your actual environment. How many of the calls look like they might be unwanted? And that gives you the cost of the problem so you can make some decision about whether or not it makes sense to solve for that. So those are the 3 action items that you can take away. Again, you can contact us or learn more, use those QR codes that you see. And then I think that's the end, Victoria. We can wrap it up and talk about any other questions that are on the board.
And by the way, Vicki, let me jump in here. I see one question that came in that maybe I'll jump ahead of that I can see in the screen right now. It's more of an edge case, but you know, some callers do use caller ID blocking, and I think it's really important to know. And hopefully you've heard this a couple of times that there are we give the tools back to the admin on what to do with calls. So if you choose to, if there is no caller ID, it's easily routed. These calls can be easily routed to a special skill group that might be more trained to address those calls. So that would be typically how we would counsel our customers to address it. But I hope that we get Skylar involved with a couple of these questions, because we're really pleased that we've got some great technical questions here that he can weigh in on. So Vicki, maybe you could send some over his way. Oh, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. Yeah, Skylar was just about to pop on to kind of talk about a question that came on here regarding Genesis and their production time. So Skylar, can you help out with that question?
Sure. That question was directed more. There was a question about they have a dev box and they don't get a lot of traffic into that, so they're wondering if they could essentially simulate spam calls into that dev environment. Sure, we can always send We can assign some numbers of spam. You can assign different numbers you want to block, test it out that way. That's not a problem at all. I saw another question. If we're integrated via SIP to a premise contact center solution, are all calls redirected to Mutari in our cloud? That answer can be a little bit more complicated. It depends on your SBC configuration. If you can essentially branch off some calls to come to Mutari, some calls to go to your regular call path, sure. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to that question, but essentially you can direct what calls you want to Mutari and let some go through. In a CCAS solution, it's super easy to do that. You basically would just insert our script into the call flows that you want, voice traffic filter applied to. So it's a very simple pointer you'd insert into your script. Makes it super easy.
Great, thank you, Skylar. We do have another one wanting to know about carrier implementation. So during the implementation, is there any need for Mutari to work directly with the carriers?
Fair question. Depends on the implementation. Most of the time, if you're a CCAS solution, you have access to some type of call flow editor. In that case, there's no need to involve the carrier. If you're more of a BYOC approach and you're using, let's say you have Teams or you have a different endpoint, and there's a SBC that your carrier is controlling, in that case, yes, we do work with some carriers in order to redirect that call to us for voice filtering, and then we move it back. So that depends on the type of solution.
So there is a follow-up. It looks like it's a BYOC for Genesis Cloud.
Gotcha. Well, the good news about Genesis, as Chuck was alluding to, we are in their App Foundry. So all you really need to do in the Genesis instance is download. There's two downloads. One is a script, and the other one is a web service. And then you will insert that script into your call flow editor. In which case, then you're calling out that API. So that's a very simple, non-SIP involved API call that hits our solution, comes back.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we're hitting a lot of technical questions here, and they're giving you a thank you, Skylar, for answering. So we have another one asking about Cisco. Can you talk about the kind of platforms we work with Cisco, like a BroadWorks, Call Manager?
Sure. We work with all of the quote-unquote legacy Cisco systems for SIP implementations, so we can do any Cube implementation, any basic SIP implementation. We also have just released our API for Cisco Contact Center as well, so our Cloud Contact Center. So we are fully up and stood up for that, ready to test that out.
Great, thank you. Looks like we do have another one here asking about the SIP headers. Is there an on-prem Mutari box which extracts the SIP headers and can send them over to Mutari in the cloud?
Question. So in the SIP implementation, there's two options. You can either utilize an on-premise solution or a completely hosted solution. The essential difference between that is that in a hosted solution, when a call comes to your SBC, your on-prem SBC, we are going to redirect SIP signaling traffic to the Mutari cloud. We will process it in our cloud, which is two data centers. One's located just outside Chicagoland. The other is located just outside of Denver. We will process that call, hand that back. There's no server lift required for the customer. That is done via TLS. That is a secure communication or a secure connection between customer environment and our cloud. The other option is there's an on-premise version as well, and that requires typically 3 virtual machines per SBC. So if you're really interested in seeing that architecture, as Vicky said, happy to set up a call, a demo. We can show you, the entire architecture now.
We have another one that popped in here, Skylar, for you. Someone says that they have a meta per meta SBC with a 302 redirect. Is that something? And we're getting really specific here. We're trying to see.
We actually do handle a 302. That is how we hand that call back to an SBC, is with that 302, which in SIP terms is temporarily moved. I don't want to get too in the weeds here. Happy to talk nerd at any point in time. But the short answer to that is yes, we do handle a 302.
Great. Well, we appreciate all of your technical questions, and please feel free to contact us separately if you think of something else that we didn't talk about here. I'm just going to pass it back over to Vicki and Chuck to see if there was anything else they wanted to add before we close out today.
I just saw a couple more pop in that might be worth at least addressing here. But one of it looks like a hospital, right? And they want to know if we're HIPAA compliant, and I think the answer to that is we have a very mature HIPAA program. So I want to make sure that's addressed for everybody. And lastly, someone has offices in the UK that are also receiving spam, and they want to know if we can service that. And the fact of the matter is that our database is in an international database. I think that's an important point. I appreciate the question. I'm sorry we didn't handle it that way earlier. We talked about how large it is, but truly it is a worldwide database.
Great. Thank you. Well, we do appreciate all of your questions. It's really made it more involved conversation, so we appreciate that. And again, we are over our time today, so we want to thank you. And if you do have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to any one of us or at info@mitari.com. We can get as detailed or specific as you need to. And if we don't have any more, then we will end today's webinar. And if you just would like to take 1 minute for a quick survey on our webinar today, we'd really appreciate it. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.